When the enemy became the healer, a German officer's shattered faith. May 7th, 1945. Somewhere near Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. The acrid smell of cordite still hung in the air, mixing with the sweet scent of spring lilacs that lined the country road. An obscene marriage of death and rebirth. Oberstleutnant Ernst Ferber pressed his hand against the blood-soaked field dressing wrapped around his abdomen, feeling the warm wetness seep through his fingers with each labored breath. 31 years old, a career officer who had climbed through the ranks of the Wehrmacht's general staff, who had helped orchestrate the movements of entire armies across conquered Europe, now reduced to this: a fugitive bleeding out in a ditch, praying that the wrong army wouldn't find him first. The shrapnel had caught him 3 hours earlier during an American artillery barrage. One final, spiteful gift from the collapsing Reich. His driver had died instantly, the staff car overturned, and Ferber had crawled into the undergrowth, waiting for death or deliverance, whichever came first. Through the haze of pain and shock, one thought crystallized with absolute clarity. Whatever happened next, he could not, would not, fall into Soviet hands. Better to bleed out here among the lilacs than face what awaited German officers in the east. The torture chambers, the show trials, the cattle cars to Siberia from which men never returned. When the American Jeep rounded the corner, its white star blazing on the hood, like some absurd herald of fortune, Ferber raised his left hand in surrender, his right still pressed against the wound, holding his intestines in place through sheer force of will. 2 young GIs approached, rifles raised, their faces impossibly young beneath their helmets. Ferber had prepared himself for execution. The Geneva Convention meant nothing when hatred ran hot, when the camps had been discovered, when the newsreels showed mountains of skeletal corpses. He had participated in the machinery of the Reich. He deserved no mercy, expected none. "Jesus Christ, he's gutted," one of the Americans said, in English. Ferber understood enough to catch the disgust, the contempt. Here it comes, he thought. The rifle butt to the face, the casual bullet, the ditch that would become his unmarked grave. Instead, the soldier keyed his radio. "This is Baker 3-7. We've got a German officer, badly wounded, needs immediate evac. Over." Ferber's mind couldn't process the words. Evac, evacuation, for a German officer? Impossible. This had to be a fever dream, the hallucination of a dying brain, starved of oxygen. The propaganda films shown to Wehrmacht officers had been explicit. American soldiers were brutal, trigger-happy cowboys who gave no quarter, who especially despised the Prussian militarists responsible for 2 world wars. Surrender meant torture, humiliation, death. Yet here was a medic, an actual medical corpsman, kneeling beside him, scissors cutting away his uniform jacket with practiced efficiency. "Easy, buddy," the medic said, his German atrocious but comprehensible. "You're going to be okay. We've got you." The morphine hit Ferber's system like a warm wave, and the last thing he remembered before losing consciousness was the medic's face. Not the face of a conqueror or an avenger, but of a man simply doing his job, treating an enemy soldier with the same care he would show his own comrades. The cognitive dissonance was so profound that Ferber wondered if the wound had already killed him. If this was some Catholic purgatory his Lutheran upbringing had never prepared him for. Ernst Ferber's journey to that blood-soaked ditch had been paved with certainty, the absolute conviction that came from serving a totalitarian state that tolerated no ambiguity, no doubt, no deviation from prescribed truth. Born in 1914 in Württemberg, he had entered military service in 1933. The same year, Hitler seized power. His career had been meteoric. Company commander in Poland, staff officer in France, rising through the general staff to reach the organizational department of the Army High Command, by war's end. He had never served in a concentration camp, never participated directly in atrocities. But he had been a cog in the machine, helping to staff divisions, allocate resources, maintain the bureaucratic apparatus that kept the Wehrmacht fighting long after any rational calculation suggested surrender. The propaganda had been relentless, omnipresent, total. Goebbels' ministry had spent 12 years crafting an alternate reality, where Germany fought a defensive war against Jewish Bolshevik subhumans and decadent Anglo-American plutocrats, where the Wehrmacht embodied chivalry and honor while the enemy specialized in barbarism, where surrender to the Western Allies meant, at best, starvation in open-air camps. At worst, summary execution or delivery to the Soviets. The newsreels showed American soldiers looting, raping, desecrating German graves. Radio broadcasts described prison camps where German POWs died by the thousands from deliberate neglect. Even the whispered rumors, those dangerous, subversive whispers that circulated despite the Gestapo, suggested the Americans were merely less barbaric than the Soviets, not actually humane. Ferber had believed approximately 60% of it, not the crude, racial caricatures. He was an educated man, a staff officer who had studied military history, who understood that the Americans and British were formidable, precisely because they weren't primitive savages. But the core message? That surrender meant suffering, that the enemy would exact revenge for years of total war, that German officers especially would be singled out for harsh treatment. That seemed entirely rational. Winners punished losers, victors took revenge. This was the way of history, the pattern established from Rome to Napoleon. His decision to flee west rather than east had been purely strategic, a calculated gamble that American pragmatism and adherence to international law might offer a 30% chance of survival versus the near certainty of death in Soviet captivity. It was the choice between probable death and certain death, nothing more. He expected, at best, to spend years in a prisoner of war camp, subsisting on minimal rations, enduring harsh conditions, waiting for distant treaties to secure his eventual release to a shattered, occupied homeland. He never expected salvation. Ferber woke to whiteness. White ceiling tiles, white walls, white sheets pulled up to his chest. The sharp smell of antiseptic burned his nostrils. Not the organic rot of a field hospital, but the chemical cleanliness of modern medicine. For a disoriented moment, he thought he was back in Berlin, in the Charité hospital, that the past 6 years had been some extended nightmare. Then the pain hit. A deep, surgical ache in his abdomen that told him someone had opened him up and rearranged his insides. He tried to sit up, gasped, fell back against the pillow. "Whoa there, Colonel. Easy does it." The nurse appeared at his bedside, an American woman, maybe 25 years old, with red hair pulled back in a professional bun. She spoke in English, but slowly, clearly. "You're in a surgical ward of the 3rd Army Medical Facility. You've had emergency surgery. The doctor will want to examine you, but the operation was successful. You're going to live." Ferber stared at her, his mind struggling to process not just the words but the impossible reality they described. Surgery? Successful surgery? On a German officer? Within hours of capture? He had been dying, truly dying, peritonitis setting in, his abdominal cavity compromised by shrapnel. That kind of injury required immediate intervention, the kind of surgery that demanded an operating room, anesthesia, trained surgeons, antibiotics, blood transfusions, post-operative care. The kind of medical resources that should never, ever be wasted on an enemy prisoner. "I don't understand," he said in careful English, his accent thick but intelligible. "Why am I alive?" The nurse gave him a look that mixed compassion with something like pity. "Because we're doctors and nurses, honey. That's what we do. Now lie still while I check your vitals." Over the next hours and days, the full scope of his treatment became clear through conversations with medical staff and other wounded prisoners. The American Field Hospital was a marvel of military medicine, a fully equipped surgical unit capable of performing complex operations under battlefield conditions. When Ferber had arrived, unconscious and bleeding out, he had been triaged by a surgeon who made a split-second decision. This patient could be saved, therefore this patient would be saved. No discussion of nationality, no debate about whether enemy officers deserved treatment. Just medicine, practiced with ruthless efficiency. The surgery had lasted 3 hours. A team of 2 surgeons and 4 nurses had worked to repair his perforated intestines, remove the shrapnel fragments, irrigate his abdominal cavity with antibiotics to prevent infection. He had received 2 units of blood, American blood, type O negative, the universal donor type, reserved for emergencies. The same blood that flowed through the veins of GIs fighting to destroy the Reich now kept a German officer's heart beating. The cognitive dissonance was so extreme it felt physical, a kind of mental nausea worse than any post-operative pain. Ferber's entire worldview, 12 years of Nazi indoctrination, layered over centuries of German military tradition, had prepared him for many outcomes. Death in battle, capture and imprisonment, even torture and execution. It had never, not once, prepared him for being saved. In the bed next to him lay an American lieutenant, 22 years old, hit by German machine gun fire during the final push through Bavaria. They had performed surgery on both men simultaneously, enemy and ally side by side, receiving identical care from the same medical staff. When the American regained consciousness 2 days after Ferber, his first question to the nurse was whether the German in the next bed was okay. "Yeah, he's gonna make it," the nurse replied. "Thanks for asking, Lieutenant." The American turned his head to look at Ferber, their eyes meeting across 3 feet of linoleum floor. "Glad you pulled through, buddy. War's over anyway. Might as well all go home." Ferber felt something crack inside his chest. Not his ribs, not his diaphragm, but something deeper, something structural that had held his identity together for 3 decades. This enemy soldier, wounded by German fire, was genuinely relieved that his enemy had survived. There was no hatred in his eyes, no desire for revenge. Just the exhausted camaraderie of men who had both come too close to death and were grateful to have escaped it. The food arrived on a metal tray 3 times daily, and each meal was a small earthquake of revelation. Breakfast: scrambled powdered eggs, toast with actual butter, bacon, coffee with real cream and sugar. Lunch: beef stew thick with vegetables, bread, canned fruit. Dinner: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. Occasionally, even dessert, cake or pie or cookies, baked by the USO volunteers who staffed the mess facilities. Ferber stared at his first breakfast tray as if it were an alien artifact. This was May 1945. Germany was a smoking ruin. The entire Reich was collapsing into starvation, its transportation networks destroyed, its agricultural regions overrun, its cities reduced to rubble. In Berlin, civilians were eating rats and tree bark. On the Eastern Front, German soldiers were surrendering in the tens of thousands simply to escape hunger. Ferber himself had been living on army rations that had been progressively reduced throughout 1944 and early 45. 1 hot meal every 2 days if you were lucky. Thin soup with mysterious ingredients if you weren't. And here, in a prisoner of war hospital, the enemy was feeding him better than he had eaten in 2 years. Not survival rations, not minimal sustenance. Actual food, prepared with care, sufficient in quantity to restore health. The orderly who collected his empty breakfast tray grinned at Ferber's expression. "Good, huh? Wait till you try the chocolate pudding at dinner. Cookie makes it from scratch. Later, Ferber learned the numbers, and the numbers were obscene. The American military logistics apparatus was so vast, so overwhelming, so incomprehensibly wealthy, that even prisoners of war, even enemy officers, were fed from surplus that would have sustained entire German divisions. The United States was producing 50% of the world's manufactured goods, its factories untouched by bombing, its farmlands endlessly fertile, its supply lines stretching unbroken across oceans that American warships controlled absolutely. Feeding one German lieutenant colonel cost approximately nothing in their calculus, a rounding error in a budget measured in billions of dollars. But it wasn't just the quantity, it was the care. The orderlies asked if he needed anything. The nurses checked his pain levels, adjusted his medications, brought him extra pillows when he couldn't sleep. The doctor who had performed his surgery stopped by every morning to examine his incision, genuinely interested in his recovery, asking questions about symptoms with the focused attention of a professional who took pride in his work. No one spat on him. No one called him a Nazi pig. No one treated him with the contempt he had been trained to expect and, truthfully, believed he deserved. They treated him like a patient, a human being whose suffering mattered, whose recovery was a goal worth pursuing, whose life had value despite the uniform he had worn. It was unbearable. 3 weeks into his recovery, Ferber was transferred to a larger POW facility, a converted Wehrmacht barracks near Mannheim, that now housed several thousand German officers, awaiting processing and repatriation. The facility was supervised by American military police, but the internal administration was left largely to the prisoners themselves under minimal oversight. It was here that the full scale of the cultural shock began to crystallize into something approaching understanding. The camp library contained over 5,000 books, not just technical manuals and approved literature, but everything. American novels, British newspapers, French philosophy, Swiss periodicals. All the forbidden knowledge that the Reich had spent 12 years suppressing was suddenly, casually available. Ferber spent hours reading the New York Times from the past year, his worldview crumbling with each article. The Americans had been planning post-war reconstruction of Germany since 1943. They had detailed blueprints for democratic governance, economic recovery, integration into a new international order. These weren't the plans of conquerors intent on revenge, but of pragmatists who understood that a stable, prosperous Europe required a stable, prosperous Germany. The Morgenthau Plan, the proposal to reduce Germany to an agricultural state, had been explicitly rejected as both cruel and impractical. "They're going to help us rebuild," said Hauptmann Weber, a former artillery officer who occupied the bunk below Ferber's. Not out of kindness, out of self-interest. They understand that a destroyed Germany becomes a communist Germany, and they fear Stalin more than they hate us. It was true, and it was devastating. The Americans weren't angels, they were calculators. They had performed emergency surgery on Ferber, not because they loved him, but because treating wounded prisoners upheld the Geneva Convention, which protected their own soldiers in captivity. They fed prisoners adequately because malnutrition bred disease, and disease spread beyond barbed wire. They allowed access to uncensored news because psychological research showed that exposure to truth was more effective at deprogramming Nazi ideology than any coerced re-education. Everything was strategic, everything was calculated, and yet the effect was identical to mercy. The British historian who visited the camp in June to conduct interviews was explicit about this paradox. "You're experiencing what we call enlightened self-interest," he told a group of officers during an informal lecture. "The Americans have determined that treating you humanely serves their strategic goals. But consider this. Is there any meaningful difference between mercy calculated and mercy felt? You are alive. You are fed. You are healing. Does the motivation truly matter?" Ferber wanted to argue that, yes, motivation mattered absolutely, that cynical calculation could never equal genuine compassion. But his body, his living, healing body that should have died in that ditch, testified otherwise. He was alive because American doctors had decided his life was worth saving. The complexity of their reasoning, the mixture of humanitarian values and strategic calculation, didn't change the fundamental fact. They had chosen life over death, healing over revenge, the future over the past. The breaking point came in July during a routine dental examination. Ferber had been suffering from a bad molar, infected and painful, and the camp dentist, a cheerful captain from Milwaukee, pulled it without fuss, administered proper anesthesia, gave him antibiotics to prevent infection, sent him back to the barracks with instructions to avoid hard foods for 3 days. It was such a small thing, such an ordinary thing, the kind of routine medical care that any person in a civilized society could expect. But Ferber remembered Stalingrad. He remembered the reports from the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht soldiers dying of gangrene and infected wounds because there were no antibiotics, no proper surgery, no medical supplies. He remembered the field hospitals where doctors performed amputations without anesthesia because the morphine had run out. He remembered the endless lists of casualties, the mountains of dead, the frozen corpses stacked like cordwood. And here he was, an enemy prisoner, receiving better dental care than German soldiers had received at the height of the war. That night, Ferber sat on his bunk and wept. Not quietly, not with dignity. He sobbed like a child, his body shaking with the force of delayed grief and recognition. Weber looked up from his book but said nothing. Almost every man in the barracks had experienced this moment, this breaking wave of understanding that swept away the last pillars of belief. The propaganda had lied, not just about enemy cruelty, that was obvious now. It had lied about everything. The superiority of German culture, the necessity of total war, the righteousness of the cause, the inevitability of final victory. Every pillar of the Nazi worldview had been systematically wrong about every significant question, and millions had died, German soldiers, Russian civilians, Jewish families, Allied troops, in service of an ideology that had been wrong about the fundamental nature of reality. Ferber had served that ideology with competence and dedication. He had helped staff divisions that committed atrocities in the East. He had processed paperwork that sent men to their deaths. He had been a small but functional cog in an enormous machine of destruction. And the only reason he was alive, the only reason he had survived to understand his complicity, was because his enemies had been better people than his propaganda had claimed. The irony was so savage it felt like punishment. To be saved by your enemy, to owe your life to the very people you had tried to destroy, to discover that mercy existed, but only after you had forfeited any right to claim it. When Major Johnson from Army Intelligence came to conduct his interview in August, Ferber was ready to talk, not because he had been broken by torture or coercion. The Americans didn't bother with such crude methods. He was ready because silence felt like continued service to a lie. And he was done with lies. "Tell me about the organizational department," Johnson said, setting up his tape recorder on the interview room table. "What was your role? What did you know about the situation in the final months?" Ferber told him everything. The desperate attempts to form new divisions from old men and children, the complete breakdown of the replacement system, the fraudulent reports sent to Hitler claiming units were at full strength when they were barely platoons, the internal memoranda that circulated among staff officers in March '45, explicitly discussing the hopelessness of the military situation while officially maintaining the fiction of possible victory. The suicides, the defeatism, the knowledge, absolute and certain, that the war was lost but could not be ended because ending it meant confronting Hitler, and confronting Hitler meant death. "Why are you telling me this?" Johnson asked after 3 hours of detailed testimony. Ferber looked at him steadily. "Because you saved my life when you had no obligation to do so. Because you treated me with dignity I did not deserve. Because the regime I served was wrong about everything that mattered, and the only honorable thing remaining is to testify to that error. Johnson studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You understand that this information will be used. That we're building intelligence on Soviet capabilities, preparing for the possibility of conflict with our former allies. Yes, Ferber said. I understand perfectly. I am choosing one calculation over another. You calculated that my life had value. I am calculating that your civilization, flawed, hypocritical, self-interested as it may be, represents a better future than the alternative. This is not idealism, Major. This is merely accurate accounting. Johnson smiled slightly. You're going to do well in the New Germany, Colonel. We need people who can calculate accurately. The years that followed were not simple. Nothing about Reconstruction was simple. Ferber was released in late 1946, his health restored, his body bearing the surgical scar that he would carry until his death 5 decades later. He returned to a Germany that existed in 3 occupation zones, a divided nation struggling to process collective guilt and collective suffering simultaneously. He could have returned to civilian life, found work as an engineer, a businessman, a teacher. Many former Wehrmacht officers did exactly this, melting into the landscape of the new Federal Republic, their pasts conveniently forgotten in the frantic work of Reconstruction. But Ferber made a different choice. He joined the Gehlen organization, that curious hybrid of former Wehrmacht intelligence officers working for American handlers to gather information on Soviet forces in East Germany. It was collaboration with the occupiers. It was also survival. It was also, in its own way, continued military service. When the Bundeswehr was founded in the 1950s, Ferber was among the first generation of officers recruited to build the new German army. His career resumed its upward trajectory. Division commander, inspector of the army, and ultimately, in 1973, commander-in-chief of Allied forces, Central Europe. A man who had served the Wehrmacht at the height of its power, now commanded NATO forces. American, British, German soldiers, united under one command structure, defending Western Europe against the possibility of Soviet invasion. The historical irony was not lost on anyone. Journalists asked him about it constantly in his later years, especially after retirement. How could he serve the very nations that had destroyed his country? How could he command American soldiers when American bombers had incinerated German cities? How could he defend democracy when he had served dictatorship? In a television interview conducted in 1992, 3 years after the Berlin Wall fell and 6 years before his death, Ferber gave his most complete answer. I learned something in 1945 that changed everything I thought I understood about power and civilization. I learned that mercy is a strategic calculation, but that doesn't make it less real. The Americans saved my life, not because they loved me, but because their system of values demanded it. They fed me not from kindness, but from logistical surplus and enlightened self-interest. They treated me with dignity because their military culture required it. And you know what? It worked. Their calculated mercy was more effective than any propaganda, any ideology, any coercion could ever be. It transformed not just my loyalty, but my understanding of what makes a civilization worth defending. He paused, looking directly into the camera with the steady gaze of a man who had spent half a century thinking about one pivotal moment. In that ditch near Pilsen, I was certain I would die. I had been taught that surrender meant death, that the enemy was merciless, that our cause was righteous despite our defeats. I was wrong about everything, and the price of being wrong was being saved by the people I had tried to destroy. That is a debt that can never be repaid, only honored through service to the values that permitted that mercy to exist. The interviewer pressed him. But you served Hitler first. Doesn't that compromise? Of course it does, Ferber interrupted. I carry that compromise every day. I helped staff the armies that destroyed Europe. I participated in the machinery of the Third Reich. The fact that I never served directly in atrocities doesn't absolve me of complicity in the system that committed them. I was wrong. We were all wrong, and the Americans were right. Not morally perfect, not without their own sins, but fundamentally right about what kind of civilization could sustain itself without devouring its own people. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper that nevertheless carried absolute conviction. You want to know what broke my faith in the Reich? It wasn't the defeat. It wasn't the discovery of the camps, though God knows that should have been enough. It was the moment I woke up in that hospital and realized the enemy had saved my life when they had every reason to let me die. That was the moment I understood that everything I had believed was a lie. Not because the Americans were angels, but because they were pragmatic enough to value life over revenge, future over past, calculated mercy over emotional hatred. That pragmatism built the world we live in now. And yes, I helped them build it because the alternative was continuing to serve a lie. Ernst Ferber died in 1998 at the age of 84, his body finally succumbing to the accumulated years and old wounds that even American medical care could only postpone, never prevent. His funeral was attended by NATO officials, Bundeswehr officers, former colleagues from both the Wehrmacht and the Alliance. The obituary struggled with how to frame his life. Collaborator or patriot, pragmatist or opportunist, survivor or symbol of uncomfortable compromise. Perhaps all of these, perhaps none. Perhaps he was simply a man who learned in the worst possible way that being saved by your enemy is more devastating than being destroyed by them. Because destruction validates your beliefs. It makes you a martyr to a cause, however wrong. Salvation forces you to confront the possibility that your enemies were right, that your cause was wrong, that the people you were taught to hate were more human than the ideology you served. That lesson, learned on an operating table in May 1945, reinforced through months of decent treatment and adequate food and medical care that should never have been extended to a defeated enemy, shaped the remainder of his life. It shaped, in miniature, the relationship between Germany and the West in the second half of the 20th century. The Americans had calculated that Germany could be rebuilt, integrated, transformed from enemy to ally through a combination of pragmatic self-interest and genuine belief in democratic values. They had bet that mercy, even calculated mercy, could reshape history. They were right. The calculation worked, and Ernst Ferber, who should have died in a ditch near Pilsen, lived long enough to help defend the civilization that had saved him. Not because they loved him, but because their values demanded it. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes calculated mercy and felt mercy produce the same result. A world where former enemies become allies, where yesterday's battlefield becomes today's partnership, where the men who tried to kill each other wake up in adjacent hospital beds and genuinely hope the other survives. War teaches many lessons, most of them terrible. But occasionally, in the ruins and the aftermath, in the surgical wards and prison camps, in the painful process of reconstruction and reconciliation, it teaches this: that pragmatism, tempered with principle, can be more powerful than ideology, that calculated mercy can transform enemies into allies, that saving your enemy's life might be the most strategic decision you ever make. Ernst Ferber learned that lesson with his body. The surgical scar he carried for 53 years was his reminder, his proof, his permanent testimony. And he spent those years trying to honor the debt he could never truly repay. The debt of being saved when you deserved to die, of being treated humanely when you had served inhumanity, of discovering that mercy exists even when it's calculated, strategic, and thoroughly pragmatic. In the end, perhaps that's what separates one civilization from another, not the absence of calculation, but what you choose to calculate. The Third Reich calculated racial hierarchies, military expansion, total war. The Americans calculated logistics, medical resources, strategic partnerships, long-term stability. One calculation produced death camps and ruined cities. The other produced surgical wards where enemies became patients, where wounds were healed regardless of the uniform, where a German officer could wake up to discover that the enemy had saved his life simply because that's what their values demanded. That difference, that fundamental difference in what you choose to calculate, is the difference between civilization and barbarism. Ernst Ferber learned it the hard way, paid for it with his certainties, and spent a lifetime trying to defend the civilization that had taught him that lesson through the simple act of refusing to let him die.